So we are now entering our final formal panel of the day. And the overall title of this one is What Say the Editors? All right, so we've heard a lot today about researchers trying to approach these topics of transparency, replication, trying to do the best possible. I think that's one of the ideas. And maybe there's not a crisis, but there are some problems. But at the end of the day, what a lot of this work is trying to do is to be published, and published in top journals. And so what we have here is we want to hear the perspective of people on that end of it, right? And that is, now of course many of us in this room play the role of reviewers, but we thought that it would be very insightful to hear what are the thoughts of the editors in terms of things they're trying to do with their journals to try to enhance transparency and replication with the products that are being produced or published in their papers, and also ways of going forward, thinking about the costs of this and what have you. And so what we have now is we're going to be starting, and again, I have a very esteemed panel. It wouldn't be otherwise they wouldn't be editors of some of the prominent journals in our field. And so to start off, and again, just very brief introductions, I have immediately to my left, your right, Elizabeth Clemens, who is the editor of the American Journal of Sociology. She's the William Rainey Harper Professor of Sociology here at the University of Chicago. Dolores Albarracin, who is the editor of Psychology Bulletin, and she's a professor of psychology at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Paul Huth, who is the editor of the Journal of Conflict Resolution. He's a professor of government and politics at the University of Maryland in College Park. Jennifer Richler, who is the acting head of Nature Research Social Sciences and the senior editor covering behavioral and social sciences for both Nature Climate Change and Nature Energy. And then finally, Jan Lakely, who is the professor in the Department of Government at American University and is the acting editor of the American Journal of Political Science, was a former editor of the American Journal of Political Science, and was a former editor of the Journal of Politics. So again, a very esteemed panel here who I think are going to offer a lot of great insights into how editors think of this. And the structure of this panel will be very much like the other formal panel. Each of our participants will give 5 minutes of remarks, followed by some moderated questions by me, then some discussion questions posed by the panel, and then finally questions by our audience members. So without any further ado, Liz.
Well, thank you to Paul and everyone at CISSR for organizing a discussion that's really been illuminating, and in my case, particularly timely. I took up the editorship just over 2 years ago, had a little bit of an administrative overload last year, so I'm finally at the point where I feel I've got my hands mostly around the beast and I'm ready to think about some of these policy questions that are facing all of our fields. So HAS has not taken a position on transparency and has sort of dealt with these questions on a case-by-case basis, most recently with Colin Jeromack, who couldn't be here, and we could have had an interesting discussion about the conversations we had about a wonderful piece of his that will be coming out very soon. Part of the reason that we, in addition to my lack of time to think, HAS publishes 6 times a year about 36 articles, but they range from ethnography to computation to survey research to archival research. So everything that's been said so far about subfields needing to come up with their own appropriate methods and rules for these issues becomes really a problem for us because part of our reason for being is to represent the best work in subfields that should be read by people in other subfields in sociology. So rather than providing a sort of model of a policy, I really just wanted to make 3 observations and raise 3 concerns that have been forefront in my thinking as I've sort of considered this policy challenge, which we've yet to resolve. So the 3 observations are that whether it's a question of is there a crisis or is there a problem, it's not singular, it's plural. That what this looks like, whatever this bubbling concern is, really varies quite a bit subfield to subfield. And it would actually be worth it if someone out there is looking for a project to do a kind of epidemiology of where these controversies that are getting disproportionate, or a lot of attention, let's say disproportionate assumes things, in the press, where are those coming from? Can we learn something about the places in the social sciences that are generating friction? The second observation is an example of what the sociologist of science, Steve Woolgar, called ontological gerrymandering. That whatever, we tend to sort of look at a problem and delineate it and let everything else be white spaces on the map or held constant. And I think what we need to really be aware of is that many of the problems as they present within questions about editorial decision-making are generated elsewhere. We're in an academic system that is under shifting policies, enormous pressures, and that means that whatever policies we adopt, we need to be both humble, because we can adopt policies that are directed at symptoms without changing the pressures that come from linking scholarship to department budgets or linking citation impact factors for different journals directly into formula for tenure. These are all things that are happening, and the decisions we make are in the face of pretty substantial pressures being generated elsewhere. So humble, but very strategic. And finally, just sort of a call, while we're talking about the concerns about rigor and replication, I think we also need to keep in mind that there's another discussion going on about making peer review faster and shorter, right? So that increasingly in my field, a number of journals have a sort of 2-paragraph model of a review, up or down. And if some of the concerns about rigor are really substantial, we need to balance those off against a competing discussion that may actually be eroding one of the important mechanisms and habits for substantial consideration. So those are 3 observations, 3 quick concerns, which we can think of as nudge, work, and wait. Nudge, one of our colleagues at the University of Chicago, of course, is, sort of famous for this insight in behavioral economics, that the way you set the default is really consequential. And so I think as journals adopt policies, even if they have a caveat that post your data and code, and if there's a problem, you can write the editor. That's a powerful setting of a default that creates incentives to do the kind of research that matches the default and creates additional costs and key additional uncertainty for those who embark on kinds of research that would require the caveat. So we need to be really mindful of that. And it's very much an issue for us at AJS because, and I'll sort of set up my colleagues in political science has been much more out in front, setting defaults and then ask for an exemption, and that has spilled over in some ways to us. We need to think about the work involved in setting up different systems. As one of our preliminary experiments, we had one of our authors participate in Colin Ellman's project of a particular method for annotating articles, so have a sense that, that's a day or 2 or 3 extra work. We just heard 80 hours from James. So that's an allocation of time and effort and time, and we all know time is short. And so we should sort of think about when and why and how much of that is warranted. And finally, I want to raise an issue of weight that picks up on a comment that Jenny made on the end of her talk. As I'm a historical sociologist, I don't think anything replicates, because after all, it generalizes theoretically, but historically, nah. But you guys who are in this world, my understanding is that funded research has a kind of patent protection, right? You get to publish. Jenny got to publish all of those wonderful articles before the data is fully available. So this is an example that also picks up on something Colin mentioned, which is any of these decisions reverberate through multiple institutions with different rules. And if the publication of data at the same time that articles go into publication becomes a norm, that says something about how that fits into time to tenure, because the work of making independently collected data has to be factored in as something to be achieved. And it also means that that work has to be foregrounded before the articles can be published that will secure additional rounds of data collection. So I think there are a set of really complicated issues here that should be kept in mind and should nuance any discussion we have about journal policies, but that doesn't mean the conversation about appropriate, though I hope, permissive standards of encouraging the sharing of data and transparency, but without, in the course of that, discouraging certain kinds of inquiry or certain topics of inquiry. But there's some serious trade-offs there.
Thank you, Paul, Jenny, and also Nick and Teresa for organizing this event. It's been wonderful to see the variety of opinions coming from different disciplines. I'm here because of Psychological Bulletin, and within the American Psychological Association, Bulletin occupies a special place in the sense that it's dedicated to synthesis of research, meaning we are the least affected in terms of reproducibility, open data, and so on. And why do I say this? Well, in part because we've been open data for a number of years. If you publish a meta-analysis, at least during my term, during the first years, and even up to now, I've been editor for 5 years, you have to produce the data have to be included in the actual paper. We're also recognizing, of course, by definition, that we are dealing with a population of effects. We never thought that we had a point estimate to reproduce, but rather than there is immense variability in what we study, often at the level of a nice square of 95, 97% in a lot of our domains. Having said this, we have a call for papers out, which has been out for a number of years. If anybody's interested in submitting, we'd be glad. And this is to study the determinants of replication, reproducibility, incentives, analyzed from the point of view of a research synthesis or meta-analysis. It cannot be computer simulation, it cannot be experimental, simply because of the constraints of what we publish. Okay, so that's my pitch for the call for papers, which remains open until the end of 2019. Now, the question that we got from Paul was, what can we do to ensure transparency and reproducibility? And I'll say a couple of things about this, and this is really my own take. I don't think it's reflected necessarily in the journal policy. But what I think we can do is primarily open spaces for intellectual reflection on the problem, accelerate methods and any sort of advancement, development along those lines, and introduce policies that are friendly, encourage, nudge. In terms of transparency, though, we have sort of a decision to make in terms of, do we want to encourage, or are we also in the business of policing what's going on? And this is, I think, the delicate problem, and I really don't have an answer. I hope my colleagues here will have an answer to this. But if we take the case of the Census Bureau, the Census Bureau is supposed to count, right? To produce an accurate count and measure as correctly and soundly as possible. If we ask the question of citizenship, well, this raises the concern of, well, how does this affect the measurement, the count itself, the responses, who participates, and so on. So if you are measuring, once you do something that could be used for policing, that creates complications because the measures might be altered. So it's quite possible that from the point of view of a journal, we need policies that reduce misreporting, that being the primary goal, and then whatever glitches appear in the data are just there to be explored by all of us. So reducing misreporting rather than necessarily pushing effortfully and in a sort of punitive way towards a particular set of rules, because the minute we do that, we really run the risk of more and more incentives to hide, put in the drawer, misrepresent, and all the things that we've seen. The other question that Paul gave us was, well, should we ensure reproducibility? And I would say, well, in the analysis, yes. A lot of the cases we've heard about, well, you have the data set, you have the code. If you put the two together, the output should be the same. That's fairly obvious. But when it comes to the findings, and this is the type of reproducibility we've been really hit with in social psychology, then I would say probably not. Not, at least in a lot of cases, thinking that any observation that we have includes something about the property that we're measuring plus measurement error, right? But the true property that we measure in social psychology, in sociology, in developmental psychology is actually changing over time. And we don't really have a good estimate of what that variance looks like if we have the same experiment conducted over 10 years. And I wish I had an answer for that, but I don't. It's pretty clear with experimental effects that we're dealing with very small effects, a D of 0.3 or so. We take it out there on MTurk, and what are we competing with? Well, we are competing with Twitter, Trump tweeting, the Kavanaugh hearings, financial markets, you name it. These effects could be huge, right? And we have our little d introduced in that great degree of variability. Should that mean we should be using or abusing the experimental method less? For certain areas, probably. That might be part of the solution. And the other two questions in my mind are, well, in addition to does it reproduce, the other question is, what's the practical significance? And this is fairly clear for a lot of disciplines. Have the findings improved early education? What has been the output of this, and what is the output currently? And finally, in thinking about this panel, I thought, well, why are we worried about this in this decade, right? We're in this post-truth era within a knowledge society, and I think it's great to be asking all these questions, even if we don't have the answers.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Paul very much for the invitation, and I've enjoyed the conference very much. And so I'll offer a few comments. I'm the editor for the Journal of Conflict Resolution by way of background. It's a political science journal, though it is quite interdisciplinary. We publish papers from political scientists, economists, psychologists, some sociologists, geographers. So it broadly represents many of the disciplines in the social sciences. It's broadly quantitatively oriented journal, a lot of observational statistical analyses, coupled with a good deal of experimental work, be it in the lab or in the field. We publish 10 times a year, roughly 60 to 70 articles a year. We receive somewhere in the vicinity of 550 to 600 submissions a year, just to give you a sense of the workflow, because some of my comments will reflect sort of the workflow that I do and some of the constraints and issues that raises in that context. So let me just turn to maybe 3 or 4 points I want to make. Some of them reflect what we're doing at the journal and how they fit into the themes of the conference. Some of them reflect issues that I think touch on the themes of the conference here, but haven't necessarily been raised a great deal, and I thought it might be helpful to put them on the table for discussion. So first of all, at JCR, we currently require all authors who have had a paper accepted for publication, before the paper will be copy edited and proceed to actually being published, they have to submit required replication materials. So that has to come in before we move forward with the publication. And that's been in place for, I've been the editor for, I think, about 9 years now. And so that's been a policy that I've followed throughout my tenure. I would like to move to the next stage, from my thinking, which is to, in addition to submitting the replication materials, having them actually executed. That is, somebody else, a third party, actually runs the replication files and materials and confirms that the findings reported in the article to be can be reproduced. So here is a practical issue that arises for me as editor. This costs money. Jan works at AJPS here, and they have a policy, and she can maybe say a little bit about it. They do have a service that they farm out, and that sort of replication or reproduction of the findings is done for them. In part, I understand that is funded through the membership dues of a professional organization that supports the journal. I work for a journal that the SAGE is the publisher, so it's not tied to a professional organization which has an income from the membership of the dues coming in. And so the SAGE would have to be the one to pay for the costs of having the replication done. And I recently had sent out an estimate, asked for an estimate of what it would cost, and it would the ballpark estimate would be in the vicinity for a year's worth of work coming in and approved articles. It would be about $25,000. And so that's not an insignificant amount of money for a publisher for one journal to consider. And SAGE has many journals, has a wide portfolio of journals, and it has expressed interest in this. But on the other hand, there are real substantial costs involved. And so at this point, while I would like to move forward with that step, it's not clear how we can do that from a financial, practical point of view. A second issue to mention that hasn't come up, though it has come up at JCR on a few occasions, which is what to do with authors who have papers in which proprietary data is drawn upon. And I find out some cases when the article has been accepted, and then I say to them, it's time to submit your replication materials. They then inform me that they can't do that. that they have proprietary data, they have an agreement with the source, and they can supply the full replication materials. And then the question is, what do I do as the editor? One is I certainly would have liked to have known that up front, but in the case, in some of these cases, it only happens at the end. And so I sort of opened that up perhaps in the Q&A. How should journals and the profession handle situations where proprietary data is used? Very interesting and potentially innovative analysis is done because of the being proprietary data, which is very unusual and distinctive. But there may be some very severe constraints on transparency and ability to replicate that kind of work. A third area to offer is just some brief comments on. In doing the reading from the very interesting syllabus, several articles talked about some of the problems of misuse and so forth associated with p-values. And so I just wanted to offer a couple of comments about that from my view as the journal editor. One is that I try to focus in part on the substantive significance of the findings reported by authors. I don't ignore the p-values, but good p-values in and of themselves aren't the whole story at all. And in fact, I've rejected some manuscripts that had, by p-value standards, looked very strong, but on substantive grounds, that is, what is the actual effect of the variables on the change in your dependent variable? Actually, that effect is very, very small. And I've just said, substantively, this isn't very meaningful, and that then raises questions about theoretically what have we really learned here. So I guess I sort of raised the issue that the substantive effects are really important too. And so I look at the size of those effects and the confidence intervals around those effects as part of the review process. The other question would be whether we would want to relax substantially p-value thresholds and so forth. And one consideration I have as the editor relates to the volume of work. And I guess I worry that if we relax it too much, that we might face a situation where we have authors submitting work with what I would consider to be very weak results, and I would just end up editorial rejecting them. I guess my view is if we were to rethink the p-value situation a bit, I would look for manuscripts where they make a case that what we thought would be true with this hypothesis or claim isn't supported by the data, and the primary results show that. But then they move on to the next step of telling us why do they think it didn't work that way, and do they have some new analysis, supplementary analysis, that sort of moves us in the direction of now better understanding why the primary claims were not supported. Otherwise, I can imagine a lot of authors, maybe cynically, who don't have good results, don't know what to do with them, feel like they can still submit it, and I would want to sort of discourage that a little bit. Then the final point that I'll make is, and it follows up on a conversation I had in the latest break, which I thought was really, really interesting, and it does relate to some of my work at JCR, which is that we also receive a fair number of formal modeling papers. And we haven't really talked too much, I think, about transparency and replication, I guess, of formal models. And part of that issue is what is presented to the reviewers, how much information do they have about how the model was set up, solved, and so forth, and how much and make sure that the reviewers get enough information so that they can credibly do their job as reviewers, and finding the reviewers who can do that. And then the larger issue, which I thought was really interesting and I had to agree with is, and I'm sort of guilty in some ways, I think, I often push formal model papers to make sure that they present the results of their formal model in a way that the non-formal modelers can hopefully understand. And there is potentially a downside to that, which is that the formal modelers can sort of gloss over or portray aspects of what they're actually doing technically in a way that isn't very clear, or is even just isn't very clear. And as a result, we understand the model actually in a way that doesn't really get to the core of what is going on in the model. We have sort of a false understanding of really what the model is doing. So I think there's this whole issue then of how to increase, I think, transparency and the replication of the formal modeling work, which we haven't talked about previously. So with that, I think I will stop.
Thank you very much for having me today. I have to say that I have been delighted by the thoughtfulness and nuance, both in the comments from my fellow panelists so far, but just all day. This has been really, really delightful, and I think it really, as you'll see, my views on this are all about nuance, and it was really refreshing to hear that this is how everybody is really, in this room at least, is thinking about these issues. It's been really great. Just to say, sort of, I'm unique on this panel, and I probably in this room, I think. So Nature editors, I am a full-time editor. I no longer do research. I am trained as an academic. All of the Nature editors, we're all PhD level scientists. We all have postdoctoral experience, but now we spend our entire day working as editors, both handling manuscripts and developing policies and really advocating for and representing our research communities. And so I think the Nature journals have a really important role to play in this conversation, both because we're highly visible, and by being highly visible, we are also under a lot of scrutiny. And so I think that we really want to be, advancing these conversations in the best way that we possibly can. However, journals, all of our journals, we come into the research life cycle really late. There's only a lot of the things in research that would make for better transparency, more reproducibility. It's too late by the time the paper comes to us. So we can only control what we can control. So I'm just going to briefly sort of talk about 3 ways where at Nature we think that we can really contribute to transparency and reproducibility. And those are policy development, enforcing reporting standards, and supporting community initiatives. And I'll talk about each in turn, but you'll see that there's really a lot of overlap. So just to talk briefly about policy development, we take policy development really seriously. I would say we're actually quite cautious in policy development, really for many of the reasons that have been described today. We're just a room of social scientists here, and there is so much diversity in the different kinds of methods, different standards, there's different issues, and all of that has come out today, which has been fabulous. Now consider that at Nature, both across all the journals, but even within individual journals, we're not just working across all the social sciences, we're working across all of the sciences. So the journals that I personally work on are publishing everything from biology to physics to engineering, economics, sociology. So for us, we really recognize that different fields have different needs, and again, that's come out today quite a lot, but we also need coherence in our policies. And of course, having all of these different disciplines all together, it's a challenge, but it's also a strength. So we need to have policies that work for everybody, but we can also draw on ideas and standards in particular fields and then look at them and say, does this apply more broadly? Is there, can we sort of push a community in a particular direction, take this idea, apply it here? But really we're cautious because there's so many differences in the kinds of research questions people are asking and what that requires. So I think a good example of that is our data availability policies. So we do have a policy that is really rooted in transparency. So for every published paper, there is a data availability statement that is in front of the paywall, so everyone can see it. And authors have to clearly say how the data will be shared, in what form, and if there are any restrictions. So authors are allowed to say things like, data are available from the first author upon reasonable request following a 2-year embargo while we finish our own analyses. That's totally fine. You just have to say what is available and how it can be accessed. Our preference is for data to be made available in an open repository with a DOI that can be cited, but we understand that really doesn't apply to a lot of cases. So that's our main policy, but at the same time, we actually do mandate data sharing in particular domains where public repositories are available. So one example is DNA and RNA sequences. Again, this doesn't really apply to this room, but just as an example, in genetics, there is a community standard where these open public repositories are available, and we're following the community there and saying, okay, if you're using this kind of data, this is what the community is saying you need to do. So that's a little bit about policy. I should also say all of our policies are developed in consultation with key stakeholders. Like I said, we view our role as being advocates for our research communities, so we never put a policy in place without having spoken to researchers on the ground to whom the policy will apply. So the second thing that we're doing is we think that we can play a really important role in enforcing reporting standards. So one of the newer initiatives we have is that all authors of papers that are sent out for review, they're asked to fill out this, what we call a reporting summary. And there's two parts to the reporting summary. In the first part, we ask authors to confirm adherence with some reporting best practices. And these are best practices that we feel, most of these are actually incredibly simple. We feel they apply across the board. So as an example, we can talk a lot, as we already have, about what the p-value threshold should be. Should we even be looking at p-values? However, one thing I think maybe we can agree on is that if you're going to report a p-value, report an exact p-value, no p less than 0.05. So this is something that we ask authors to do, so they kind of have a checklist of items like that, of that level. The second part of the reporting summary is that we ask authors to provide key details around key methodological points that we think are really important to ensure that somebody can understand exactly what was done in the study. And these include things like sample characteristics, why the sample was selected or deemed appropriate, exclusion criteria. And again, there's really a lot of nuance even there, right? So the module that I worked on developing is the behavioral and social science module. And we had to be really careful about how we worded these questions to be as broadly applicable as possible. We can't say, you need to have run a power analysis. Did you run a power analysis? What did you do? Because if you ran a field study and you had an N of 20, well, maybe you had 20 people, because there are 20 people living in that village. So that is how you selected your sample size, because you talked to every single person there. So all of our questions are designed to be as broad as possible. There's help text to sort of explain the different ways the same question could be answered for a different discipline. I should also say we don't use the answers here as like, if you say X, well then your paper, we're not going to consider it anymore. We just want it to be there. And these reporting summaries are then made available during review, and they are published online alongside the paper. And the idea, again, is not to replace the method section of a paper, but rather to ensure that this information is being reported and that all of that information is in a place that's easily accessible. You know that if you click on that reporting summary, a whole bunch of these methods details are going to be very clearly outlined there. The life science version of this reporting summary was rolled out first, and there was an independent study by people not affiliated with Nature who looked at reporting in Nature papers before and after the rollout of the reporting summary, and compared with other similar journals, reporting of some key items in life sciences research around blinding, randomization, sampling, reporting improved by a substantial amount just by having this reporting summary in place in a way where there weren't similar improvements at other comparable outlets. So we do think that the reporting summary is useful. And so in the short term, the reporting summary, it's ensuring that these key reporting standards are met. But in the longer term, we hope that authors are going to use these as a resource when developing their studies in the first place and when writing their manuscripts. The blank version of this reporting summary is freely available. Anyone can look at the things that we are kind of thinking about when we're looking at the methods of the paper. So we hope that becomes a resource for the community as well more broadly. And so then finally, we support community initiatives. I think the best example that really illustrates what I mean by that is the case of registered reports. Are people here familiar with registered reports? So registered reports, the idea is that you basically submit your introduction, your methods, and your analysis plan, and then that gets accepted. Like the editor is saying, we will accept your paper no matter what the results are. So that part gets peer reviewed, then you go collect your results and you just kind of plunk them in. But the paper's been accepted without actually seeing any data. So this was really conceptualized and I think championed by the psychology research community. There are a number of advocates for this approach in the psychology community. This is not something that we as editors, I think, would have ever come up with on our own. But one of our journals, Nature Human Behavior, psychologists is a really important community to that journal, and they said this is important for that community. There's a lot of appetite for it. So now Nature Human Behavior does offer this registered reports format because they saw that it's playing a key role in this community that's important to them. And again, I think this highlights the strength of Nature having a lot of different journals, that we can try different things, like registered reports at one journal, see how it works, see what's needed to make it work well. I can say that the experience at Nature Human Behavior is that there's a lot of value in registered reports, but they are exceptionally difficult from author, reviewer, and editor perspective. There's a lot more work involved in reviewing these than handling a typical manuscript. And with that information, we can decide whether that makes sense or doesn't make sense to have at some of our other titles, or the conditions under which we would want to do that. So I think that's all I had prepared. Again, I've been really pleased to hear all the discussions today and learn from my colleagues about what we can be doing.
On an earlier panel, thank you very much for this delightful day. I haven't read a single manuscript all day, and it has been a pleasure to be removed to this lovely room and be thinking about these important issues. So thank you, Paul and Jenny and the others. A comment that was made on an earlier panel noted how science and scientific knowledge is a human endeavor. I tell my undergraduates in research methods classes that science is communal and collective enterprise to justify a lot of what we do in procedures and the confidence we have in our findings. And that note on science being a human endeavor, I think, certainly reminded me of the belief I've had for 25 years since I first did some editing, was the observation that I believe that our journals and our professional associations, at least in political science, are fragile institutions. It takes people jumping in and engaging and committing work and to that broader endeavor that we have in what we do. And so I am editing the American Journal of Political Science, which for those of you who have followed the Replication initiative, you might know that Bill Jacoby, as the previous editor, initiated and invested a tremendous amount of time and effort as he was editor in establishing replication policy for the AJPS and working with Colin, making sure that there were appropriate procedures and policies relevant to both the quantitative and qualitative communities. He was upped for a second term in part because the Council of the Midwest Political Science Association was committed to the importance of the replication policy and the other DART kind of policies and issues that Bill had become a leader in, and that it goes to the fragility of associations and institutions that someone has to invest in establishing these policies, and I appreciate he was able to do that. And so we do have a distinctive policy where once a paper is accepted, the authors are required to submit data and code so that the results that they report in the paper can be verified. Okay, who likes footnotes here? Here's my footnote on this. I think it's sort of odd that today, and maybe it's because I'm a bit marginal to this discussion, that it seems like replication, reproducibility, and verification are all words that we use interchangeably. And I really think that there's some differences there, at least how I have thought about those different notions and different aspects. And since we're a scientific community trying to fix problems, maybe greater attention to the precision of those terms would help. Nonetheless, I'll use them interchangeably in the next few minutes that I have. So in what I'd like to talk about next, so the AJPS has played, I think, an important role. We continue to do that, and I think that's worked well given the type of research we typically publish. We can't publish the papers that aren't submitted to us, and so the large group of scholars who are very committed to replication and reproducibility have embraced this. I'd like to focus on a little bit about how the problems that I've seen in the review process this go-around editing compared to back in '96, back in the day, and in around 2010 at the JOP. And these are problems that as I jumped back into AJPS, really surprised me. A lot of things haven't changed, but some have, and I think the replication issues and also some ethical issues in terms of IRB and being aware of conflicts of interest of various sorts and how they might compromise the peer review process. Those are new, and those have a heightened, I think, visibility. I had initially had concerns about the use of online appendices actually back 10 years ago when we were doing JOP, when Cambridge suggested to us that space, there's no limit to space, it doesn't cost us anything because of their increased publication costs. And they encouraged us to use the online appendices for anything that the authors wanted to throw in there. That sounds like it might be critical to suggest that. I think there was some of that perhaps back then, but the online appendices were developed to provide extra space and words that the paper journals can't, the paper limits of the journals couldn't handle. The problem, the new editorial team, I have a team of 5 terrific associate editors, the problem that we emerged for us after about 6 weeks' time was how many complaints we were getting from reviewers. We were getting supplemental indices of 120 pages and 80 pages, and then you have someone who has an online appendix of 150 pages, and the reviewer doesn't look at how long that paper is, and they like to review a paper on paper, right, and print it out, and we take the heat for that. So we had a large number of complaints actually from reviewers. Anecdotal, it was only over a 2-3 month period, and there were numerous complaints. So we went down in history for or at least in the Twitter world, I guess. Thank you very much for communicating with us directly, for putting a limit on the online appendices. In part because of complaints from the reviewers, also because of the observation, if you will, and I think this is an issue perhaps only editors would think about, that the reviewers are under, and we say this, the reviewers are not under any obligation to read every page of those 120 pages of those online appendices. And so it was quite fascinating when at my editorial board meeting at APSA, I had one of the board members whose paper is forthcoming in the next few weeks say, "You mean the reviewers don't review the online appendices?" I said, "No." And his take was, "Wait, but those appendices are linked on the publisher page. Isn't that an imprimatur or an emblematic of being part of the peer review process?" And whether that's emblematic or not, I have always been uncomfortable as an editor to think, I don't know what's in, am I supposed to read every page of those? Does anyone read that? What if someone tries to scam us with an online appendix? right? To try to see how much attention a reviewer or an author or an editor pays to those online appendices. And so I've always been uncomfortable that there indeed no requirement that the online materials are reviewed. They are provide additional information as needed, but their role in what we hope to be a peer review process and with reviewers complaining, we put a limit on the pages. Now, several communities were upset by that, though not communicating directly to any of us. And we, as we intended, we said in general a limit of 20 pages, knowing that there would be exceptions, because if you're doing, if you have question wording, if you have qualitative interview data, if you have historical or community context that has to be part of the citing your work, you're going to need more of those pages. And so what we do is ask that if you want more than 20 pages, simply make that request. And I'll just say those few authors who have asked to do that are batting 100% at getting the additional pages. In part, what we wanted authors to do would be to stop and think about what they're putting in the appendix and make them useful documents for reviewers. When it's 120 pages, some of which is not necessarily formatted, organized, or obviously relevant to different parts of the paper, I don't feel it's right to ask reviewers to sort that out for themselves. So we put a little more onus on authors, and they seem to be coming in fine form, and I think that helps. As one experimental political scientist said, yeah, longer, poorly organized, irrelevant appendices might look good, but they don't necessarily help in the peer review process. So hence we raised the question. I think there was some attention paid. And speaking to Mike Alvarez, who was editor of Political Analysis for a long time, Mike noted, we don't have any common standards for what material should be provided. And do you think we could get journals to agree to what would be common, or communities, particular communities, to determine what's relevant or how to organize? And we don't know that. And so finally, since Paul's pulling the plug on my time, I'd say I think this is a work in progress, and I think these discussions help to further it. There are many other concerns, I think, as well, about the integrity of the research that we publish. And I caution, to me, that kind of the limitation is if our sense of replication is that I give you the data and I give you the code so that the exact results can be repeated. I wonder if that begins with the final data set that the author uses. We just can't lose sight of the fact of the thousands of decisions we as researchers make before we get that final data set in order. And that circles back to my request for clarification of terms. Are we replicating? Are we reproducing? Are we verifying? And to perhaps be a little more precise on those points.
Going back to thinking about the supplemental materials, right? And we've had a lot of discussion. We've heard a lot about supplemental materials in a qualitative study, supplemental materials and surveys in terms of the instruments. We have discussions by editors about restrictions or allowing and infinite space for it. One of the things I wanted to do is first I'm going to ask a very general kind of like a request. If Jen, if you could say a little bit about how nature goes about the process. And the reason why is because I think this is a unique opportunity, because nature has a very different model in terms of the relationship of the published paper to the supplemental materials. And then I would love to be able to hear the other editors' thoughts about the feasibility of that model as it would apply to their journal. So Jen, if you could, please.
Yeah, so I think the one feature of Nature papers that everyone knows is that they're short. And just to preface this by saying there is a reason for that. It's not because we have short attention spans. Our goal at Nature journals is we want as many people to read your paper as possible, and for people from different disciplines to read your paper. So what we try to do is we want all of the information necessary for a general reader, an educated general reader who, roughly knows scientific methods to understand your question, what you did, what you found, and why it matters. But we also want your paper, we want to balance that with all of the technical and theoretical evidence that a specialist in your field would need to say that is strong, robust research. And so our approach to that is we use the supplements like crazy, right? So our papers are, 3,000 words, but for a lot of key details, in the paper you might have one sentence that says, these results were robust, controlling for XYZ. See supplementary note 1. And then you're going to go to the supplement, and there are all the details. So any reader knows that you did those robustness checks, but not every reader really cares to look at the model and look at the details. But one thing that we do when the paper is about to be accepted, you are not allowed just to say, look at the supplementary information. You have to be exceptionally specific. So you must say, see supplementary note 1, see supplementary analysis 2, see supplementary table 3. So you are pointing to a very, very specific item in your supplement. I have to say, I've also never seen a supplement that's 150 pages. That blows my mind. Me too. So what we're trying to do, so not every reader is going to care, even an expert reader is not going to care about every single part of your supplement, but you are telling them exactly where the information is that they need to sort of unpack a single point that's in the paper. And sometimes that requires us as editors to do a lot of work hands-on when a paper is coming in, but I think it helps make the papers more readable, and that's really our goal at the end of the day.
That's great. So with that model in mind, because this isn't the first time I've ever heard this question posed, I've heard people say, why can't we just do it like Nature? Why can't we do it like Science, where we have the shorter papers, quick, easy to read, longer than 280 characters, but it still allows people to digest and then have a supplement. So I would really now, given, Jen, thank you for that kind of description there, I would like to hear about the thoughts that each of you, the other editors, have about the feasibility of that model working within your journal. So we'll start with Liz.
So we have quite a different philosophy on word length. Generally, if a paper comes in at less than 8,000 words, we think it's probably not for us, and we publish some very long papers. Our practice is that there's not a limit on supplementary materials, but if materials are in the supplement rather than the body of the article, they can only be referred to once. So what we don't want, we want to avoid that kind of hyperlinking to the supplement. So a good supplement would be, we've run a whole lot of robustness checks. And mention that once. If someone's concerned about it, they can go to the online material. But we really do try and sort of, we're aiming at the article in a subfield that should be read by other people in the discipline and related disciplines, and we want that contained in the text for the most part.
So I just want to add one thing that I kind of forgot to mention also about the supplements, that not only does in the paper you can't just say, see the supplement, every single item that is in your supplement must be referred to in the main text. So you can't just have random stuff in there at the end that you never connect to the text.
Yeah.
That's also part of it.
Dolores.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Who reviews those? I mean, is the editor responsible for reading the supplements, reviewers?
Yeah,
What's the
it comes in with the paper. I mean, we assume that our reviewers are reading them. I mean, of course, you never know what reviewers are reading. Yeah. But I should say a lot of the times the supplements, I think in our case, they are more likely to be read because they often contain some of the key details that at disciplinary journals would be in the main paper. Like, they are actually more fundamental to the main analysis in a way that they end up having to be read. I think also the supplements tend to grow in the review process. A reviewer asks for something and then it's included in the supplement. And when that goes back to reviews, you can see the reviewer says, I can see in supplementary table 3, they did X, Y, Z. So we do get evidence that they are reading the parts of the supplemental analysis that are relevant to them. I read them. Again, we've never had ones that are that long. Usually there's a lot of supplementary figures, tables, and we're making sure that they're linked and that they kind of make sense.
Bulletin is sort of this model of very long detailed papers with no page limit. So occasionally we get a 300-page manuscript and nobody reviews, of course, and we send that back. But other than that, the manuscripts tend to be 80 to 120 pages. So authors know that whatever is essential must be in the paper, but they often add a supplement. And when that happens, and for instance, we had a correction of a meta-analysis of menstrual cycle effects and a very long supplement that I also had to correct, I felt, but it wasn't really clear. It's quite painful to have to go through that.
JCR publishes papers that are typically between 8 and 11,000 words.
So many words.
Supplemental material. So I have sort of a split reaction to it in the review process and so forth. When reference is made in the manuscript to like robustness checks and things that aren't reported in with the tables and so forth in the main manuscript, I say to the author, that has to be included in the replication materials because that's like central to your findings. If there's a reference to something that's sort of secondary but useful additional information that they want to put into a supplemental appendix, that's, I guess, is fine with me, but it doesn't have to necessarily go into the replication files. Mm-hmm. So there's certain types of supplemental information that I treat differently. Some of it just goes online. Some of it has to be in the replication files. I've seen some very long replication supplemental documents attached to the papers. I've seen 80 to 90 pages, which I think is ridiculous and is not useful to the reviewers. And so I would agree that there's a need to bring that down. I think the question of can you get down to 3,000 words?
Every paper can be 3,000 words.
I'm sure,
promise.
I'm sure
we had this conversation at dinner last night.
I think that's a discussion with my publisher, and not so much that, I agree. Any paper, any well-written paper could get to the point and do that in 3,000 words. So I wouldn't actually object to that as being the model, but I'd have to buy in from Sage, my publisher, that that's what they want. That's the model that they want to move to.
So all of those principles I fully endorse, and I'm glad to know that we aren't totally whacked out. But I will report like the other detail that I failed to mention. There's no requirement, like you can't give us a review if you haven't read every page of the supplementals. At the same time, and this is the other limitation that the next editor or editorial team will need to take on, not me, is that we send replication files to the Odom Institute, and the Midwest pays them to replicate all the analyses that are in the main body of the manuscript. So you can see all of those all those robustness tests in the online appendix, and Odom doesn't touch that material. So, okay, that to me there's a mismatch. But I'm okay with 10,000 words, but I don't think we're good enough writers to get down to 3,000, frankly. And I also think some words are valuable for AJPS because it may be, I don't know, old-fashioned, but I think of an AJPS paper as a paper that has a strong theoretical advance or contribution as well as appropriate methods. And I think you need some words just to work in most social science kind of theory or arguments. And again, we just don't write very well, so.
So here's an observation. I think any time that we reduce the amount of, so when we are evaluating a project or evaluating a paper by an expert, any time that we prevent the amount of information that can be communicated to the decision maker, here you are the decision maker, then we tilt the stage in favor of those who that we believe they are better than others. In this particular case, if you only allow for up or down, it means that those who are in the elite school are going to be favored. Because these are the people, absent any other information, we prefer to publish their paper because we believe they are better than others. So another situation, now turning to Paul's comments on the formal modeling, another situation in which information cannot be transmitted from reviewers is when the number of reviewers are very few. So imagine there are only, for example, 2 statisticians in the world, Blake and Andrew. So when Andrew sends a paper to you, you have to send it to Blake. Blake just left. When Blake sends you a paper to you, you have to send it to Andrew. You may do it a couple of times. By the 4th time, you are going to say, well, I can't really trust that kind of judgment. And this is the kind of, so you just cannot make assessment based on these reviewers. And this seems to be a problem that we have in formal modeling when we have only maybe 20 people that can make the judgment.
Right. So any responses to this? Yeah.
I would just note that I've seen plenty of reviewers who are personal friends or colleagues in small research communities be very happy to be very critical of each other's work. And this is not because they're from a different subfield or they have an entirely different intellectual approach. And so I don't, so will there be bias? Is it a perfect system? Are there mistakes? Maybe I'm old and naive, but a lot of reviewers are pretty upfront about those sorts of things. So small communities are difficult because you want to get experts. The bigger problem I'm having right now is with kind of the more collective organizations of experimental folks, EGAP, for example. Everyone knows the big projects, and the author anonymity thing is harder. So I understand some of that, but reviewers can be quite direct and I think honest, and you can read those reviews and see when they aren't.
I would say we tried quite deliberately to select a set of reviewers from different positions. So the expert reviewer in that area may well know the author, but at least for us, it's also important that it's interesting. My predecessor's editor thought about this as sort of the Philippines. It's got to be interesting to the person on the next island as well, and it has to be comprehensible. So if you think about assembling a sort of suite of reviewers from different positions, that can be helpful. I would also say I think that phenomenon has enormous variation across different subfields. And if you've edited for a while, you know where the problem is, that there are some communities that are collectively very agreed on standards and tend to have very little variation in their assessments. So,
Any of the other editors?
I would just add that what I often try to do is I go to my editorial board for those who have formal modeling skills to draw upon them in these situations. I also go into the profession and ask people who are formal modelers do they have really good PhD students at advanced stages who can do the formal modeling, who aren't going to know necessarily this paper as well and who this person is, but I get sort of the message from them. They've got the skills to handle this kind of a formal paper. So I try to increase the pool, the technical pool in that way from time to time.
Presumably it's necessary for some non-trivial number of transparent research to be redone or reread or revisited in some way for it to be worth doing in the first place. So one possibility, I guess, would be if journals actually published replication studies, but many of the top journals don't. So I'm curious to know how do you see any other role that editors might play in helping to encourage research that you have published, that's been published according to some transparency standards, and so making it possible to encourage subsequent scholars to actually earn some coin by revisiting them?
Very good. So anyone who wants to start with that? Dolores?
The American Psychological Association's journals, several currently have replication sections or some format, so that's in place, I think, to a great extent by now, including major replication efforts, like many labs and so on, that have been promoted by the journals and also specifically by APS.
Informally at JCR, I get manuscripts from people who are responding to prior work, sometimes prior JCR work, and they're raising, they replicate it, but then they raise some issues about it. And sometimes I will bite on that and then generate a debate. So I'll have the original author respond to the replication piece, and so I have an exchange between the authors then in JCR. So that's one way that I try to do that. Again, it's sort of maybe the flavor of my p-value comment. If I get a manuscript where there's a question about replication, I'm always looking for some new added insight, not just, I can't replicate what scholar X did. I want to know, there's an issue here, and then this is how I've sort of looked at it a little bit further, and I've got a new insight about what is going on that this original author didn't understand. So I want to push the debate of the literature forward as opposed to just saying, I can't quite duplicate, for example, what this author did.
Yeah, I actually really resonated with one of the comments that was made this morning about not wanting just replication for replication's sake, because what do we learn? So there's a lot of very valuable replications because there's a very good reason to be asking this question. And so I think that there's definitely a home for that, and I would say that one of the uses of the registered report format at Nature Human Behavior is quite specifically for replications. Now, you can't just say, I want to try to replicate this study. You have to have a really good reason why this replication is actually really important theoretically and conceptually to do. And that is one use of the registered report format, where they do accept sort of replication studies. I would say at the other nature journals, we tend, just the replication isn't enough, very similar to what others have said. You need to build on, so if you fail to replicate someone's work, okay, well, have you done something to show us why you couldn't replicate it in this context? Have we learned something new from your failure to replicate besides just, I couldn't get it to work? But again, I think the registered report format at Nature Human Behavior is really a good outlet for those kinds of endeavors.
I was going to make exactly the same point, that I think we need to ask replication to what end, and but I also wonder if journal editors are the right actors to do this. It strikes me that an alternative is to start thinking about this as an element of graduate training. Right? Most departments in my field have a writing seminar, getting out that first paper, and you could well imagine an element of a training program being doing a replication of major studies, and maybe 1 out of every dozen or every 20 turns up something that answers that to what end and gives the student sort of a place to move forward with an interesting project. So I think we may be too far along in the process, but there are other places to encourage it.
Right, or training could be that you replicate your own study before you submit it to a journal in the first place, that you do your own replication before. And I've definitely seen papers that come in where they've done the study and then they have, and we replicated it, in this other sample, it's in the supplemental. But that, I think, is part of training. You replicate your own and that's not obviously possible for all research questions, right? As we kind of talked about this morning, but that could be a part of training.
Any other comments? I think that's an excellent point to end on. I'll just say from my own personal vantage point, I like that you brought up about the graduate training, because a few of my graduate students are in the room, they know that's part of how our courses work, is taking a study, replication, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And even thinking about what Paul said about the kind of controversy section that they might do in JCR, the journal International Security will do the same thing on the qualitative side. A historian might write and say, I don't agree with that interpretation of the Korean War, and then they'll put together a similar thing like that. So there are ways to go about doing this in journal formats, the existing formats. But I think that this session has been great for thinking about, are there other ways to do it? What would those things be? What are the costs to doing that? So I think this was just a terrific panel. And so again, thank you. Let's give a round of applause.